CaliforniaToday.com. And now we continue with this discussion focusing on the state of California in our House Battleground series. As you continue to call in, we're joined for this discussion by Renee Van Vechten, political science professor at the University of Redlands. Professor Van Vechten, thanks for getting up early for us this morning. We talked about some of the handful of toss-up races, but the Cook Political Report has 13 races in play this cycle, from toss-up to leans one way or the other. Is that unusual for that many races, that many House seats to be in play in a midterm election cycle?
Well, I think in any given election, there are going to be a handful of races that are toss-ups, because whoever the minority party is, they're going to be going after those seats as hard as they can. And in this cycle, we see the Democrats really going after those Republican seats if there's even a whiff of vulnerability. And in some cases, there's a chance that the Republicans, if there really is a large Democratic turnout, that some of those races in which the Republicans have been very strong, that they might be overtaken. So if those do actually turn, then I think those would be a good sign that the House is going to turn Democratic.
We've shown our viewers a map of where these districts are that we're focusing on in California, a large number located in Southern California. What does that tell us about the political fault lines in California today?
Well, the fault lines have actually been shifting a little bit. We see that Democrats really do have a plurality registration in the state. Some are about 45% Democratic registrants in the state. But we've also seen that for the first time, Republicans are actually a minority as far as registration goes, and they've been overtaken by those who call themselves no party preference voters. So what we've been watching, if you watch the registration numbers, really California has been moving into the Democratic column, although we're not an absolute majority Democratic state. As you can see, we're not over 50% Democratic, but we are Democratic, at least in terms of overall the top number of Democrats who are registered. So what we see is playing out is here in Southern California, that maybe in the last few decades, Republicans have had an advantage. Democrats have been slowly overtaking those numbers in several districts, and so that's being reflected in the competitiveness of these races.
California is certainly considered a reliably blue state. When was the last time it was a red state or even a purple state?
Well, the last time we actually had a strong Republican unified government, meaning that both the Assembly and the Senate, which are our state legislatures, two chambers, and the governorship held by a Republican, was back when Ronald Reagan in the 1960s was the governor. And ever since then, we have had, well, let's see, about the Democrats sort of started to take over after about the 1970s in the legislature, and they've held it ever since. And there's only been a couple times when the legislature has gone Republican, and just a very small punctuation, whereas the governorship is flipped back and forth between the Republicans and the Democrats almost regularly. But in terms of registration, the state has registered Democrats pretty much since 1932. We were actually, the Democrats lost that absolute majority to the no party preference voters. They've been actually taking over since about 1989 or so. But overall, we're a pretty Democratic state. So today, if you look at the statewide executive, we have all Democrats who have got the major offices. That includes people like the governor, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and so forth.
Taking your calls as we focus on California in 2018 and the House races there that could help decide control of the House of Representatives. Some 13 races considered to be in play this cycle, right. 5 in the most competitive categories. Phone lines, if you want to join the conversation. If you're a California resident, 202-748-8000. All others, 202-748-8001. Professor Van Vechten of the University of Redlands will be with us until 10 o'clock this morning. We'll start with Matthew calling in from Emerson, New Jersey. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. The facts here with regard to California's increasing crime rate are important. When President Trump called Democrats the party of crime, the facts show he's right, because the Democrats in California have been giving early release to convicted criminals, which has led to, no one's surprise, an increase in innocent citizens there being affected, assaulted, robbed, etc., by criminals who have been given this early release. And also, when Democrats decriminalize drug possession, as they have in California, Massachusetts, and some other states, this also, the fact shows that drug addiction, drug abuse, and crime rates have gone up, and I would appreciate it if these good people could address that.
That's Matthew in New Jersey. Professor Van Vechten, do you want to talk a little bit about criminal justice reform in California, its impact on the politics there?
Yeah, absolutely. California has had a problem with housing its inmates, and at the state level for the past few decades, we've been overstuffing our state institutions, that is our jails and our prisons, state prisons, with people who have been convicted of crimes. And as a result, we haven't actually been funding those jails and state prisons like we should. So we had overcrowding, and as a result, the federal government stepped in and said, well, you need to do something to reduce that crime population. This really put Jerry Brown and the legislature at a disadvantage, because they face a lot of constituents who don't want to build new prisons in their backyards. So we haven't had any new prisons being built, with the exception of one in the Stockton area that's a hospital prison. So the result has been a lot of overcrowding, and the federal government telling us that we need to reduce those prison populations, and if not, they were going to be released anyway. The federal government was going to find a way for us to reduce the prison population. So the legislature and the governor came up with a few ways to try to reduce the prison population, and some of that does involve early release. Some of that has been to decriminalize certain kinds of crimes, and as a result, such as drug possession for marijuana. And as a result, what we've seen is that there has been a slight uptick in petty theft and lower level property crimes. At the top, we haven't seen huge increases in other kinds of crimes like murder. The murder rate's still historically pretty low, but if you're the victim of one of those crimes, it certainly doesn't feel like that it's going down.
Bring it back to campaign 2018. Can you remind viewers about the top two primary system in California and what impact it had on targeting districts by the two parties in the general election?
Yeah, absolutely. So California has a really interesting kind of primary system. We moved to this system just a few years ago because the citizens voted for it. And in our system, it's actually very technically called a voter preference primary. In a normal primary, that means that Republicans would turn out for their own candidates, and maybe if there are 10 people running for an office, the Republicans would vote for the person they want to move on to November to the general election, and the same for Democrats. Well, we scrapped that system. So in a top two primary, all the voters are allowed to show up to the polls on election day, and all of the candidates for a particular office are listed on the ballot. The top two vote getters will move on to the general election. So that could be two Democrats, it could be two Republicans, or any mix thereof, including the minority parties. What we found is that has led to more intra-party elections where you have Democrats versus Democrats. In fact, there are about 19 of them in this coming election. There is only one race in which there's a Republican facing off against a Republican, and that's in a congressional district. So there are some interesting kinds of consequences of having a top two primary. But it does mean that, and I should back up just a little and say that the reason we did this was to hopefully moderate the legislature, which was shown to be pretty liberal because it's been dominated by Democrats for such a long time. And the hope was that where you have where the race maybe is a foregone conclusion and a Democrat might be winning anyway, that if that Democrat who's the front runner is actually being challenged by somebody who's more moderate, then when it comes time for the general election, the entire electorate would weigh in, and you'd have Republicans joining Democrats to maybe elect more moderate Democrats, for example. And there's some mixed results about whether or not that's happened. But for the most part, the California legislature is slightly more liberal than you'd find in other states.
What was that one district where a Republican is facing off against a Republican in the general election?
Yeah, that would be Congressional District 8, where Paul Cook is facing Tim Donnelly. Tim Donnelly is far more right-wing than Paul Cook is, and Paul Cook holds the seat now. Tim Donnelly formed his own Minuteman kind of group to try to patrol the border. He's very activated by immigration issues. And so he's challenging Paul Cook, and that district kind of runs along the interior of the state. It covers a lot of territory, and if you have the district map, you'll see that it's a lot of area, but it's very sparsely populated.
Was that a place where Democrats had hoped to compete this cycle, or was this a reliably red district?
Reliably red district, yeah. Wasn't going to turn.
To Michael waiting in Pensacola, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm interested in what's going on with Devin Nunes and the Darrell Issa OC that's been vacated.
Sure. Well, the Nunes-Jantz race is a kind of race where it's very unlikely that the Democrat will take over for a couple of reasons. I think some of these races that are in the Central Valley, for example, the San Joaquin Valley, and Northern California, such as the Congressional District number 22, where Nunes is, there is a Republican edge in a lot of these districts. And so it would be surprising in some of them if the Democrat actually won. Nunes is not really, it is considered one of those congressional districts that is in play should the Democrats turn out in force. But he has a couple of factors going in his favor, one of which, and this actually applies to most of the candidates in the Central Valley, there's a very high Latino Hispanic population, and they don't tend to register at high rates, and they don't tend to turn out at high rates. And that has actually favored the Republicans in places where they might be edged out by Democrats. As far as the Darrell Issa race, that is actually down here near San Diego, and that is an open seat race, like you mentioned, and there are a couple
What district
people
is that
duking it
one?
out. That's 49, or actually that's not 49. I think it's 40, I can't remember the number offhand. I'll have to check on it. But as far as that one goes, Mike Levin is facing off against Dianne Harkey, and that is a neck-and-neck race. Issa almost lost. They had to actually do a recount at the last election, and he barely won. So Issa stepped down after having been in Congress for many years, and a very powerful Republican at that, leaving the race open. So it's opened up this very competitive race. And so those two candidates are truly neck and neck.
I've got the map of all 53 districts in front of me. The 49th district there.
49th.
Steve's up next in California in Lake Elsinore. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Professor. I'm actually fairly close to you. I've already voted. My wife and I have already voted. I also was an ex-correctional officer just for that guy from New Jersey. Mm-hmm. I retired as correctional lieutenant. Let me tell you, I voted. I used to vote Republican, but I turned independent actually, mm-hmm. and I had voted up until Jerry Brown Republican, but we had trouble getting a budget through with a Republican governor, and because the Republican Assembly, Democratic Assembly, I voted for Brown, and I was alive when Brown was a governor back in the 70s, and I knew what he was going to do. He was going to tax, but I voted for him anyway because we were having trouble getting the budget. and he did a really good job. And I did vote for Brown, and I did vote for the Democrat this time also, and also in this district. So actually, that was a vote against Trump. But anyway, I thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah.
Steve, thanks for the call this morning. Professor Van Vechten, on the role of independents in the state.
Yes. Well, it turns out that we do, as I've been mentioning, we have these this category of registration called no party preference. And that means you can actually register to vote. You don't have to register with one of the major parties. And that has been a category that's been growing over time, and it's steadily growing. And it tends to be a place where, like this particular caller mentioned, a place where you can actually go if you don't want to be registered with one of the major parties. And those people actually tend to vote the way that they lean. So one thing that political scientists have found is that if you tend to lean toward one party or the other, that's really how you do vote in the end. It doesn't hold for all times and places, and as you just heard this caller say, that person has maybe been shifting certain votes over time. But in general, what we find is that independents in California do support Democrats, and that's, of course, one of the reasons why, even though it's a plurality Democratic state, you do get solidly Democratic majorities holding on to those statewide offices, both in the legislature and also in the statewide executive offices.
Gail is in San Diego. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. You already touched on the point that I wanted to raise, which is about the ethnicity, the impact of ethnicity on the votes here in California. When you look at a red-blue map of the state, you'll see that it's the Central Valley that is essentially the red part of the state, despite the fact that the majority population there is ethnically Hispanic. And the people who get elected from those districts also often have Hispanic names, even though frequently they are from the Republican Party. And so, for example, someone mentioned Devin Nunes. He is Portuguese. His farm is in Iowa.
Yes.
But nevertheless, he has been elected over and over again, despite the fact that the Republican Party is obviously anti-immigrant, they're anti-Hispanic, and their policies tend to hurt Hispanic people here in California, tend to be lower income overall, and the Republican policies hurt them. So I'm just curious to know what you think that mix of income, ethnicity has to do with the fact and the name recognition of Hispanic Republicans being elected, what that mix means for this election.
That's actually a really great question. All of the factors that you mentioned do really weigh into the way a person identifies first and foremost with a party. And the Democratic Party tends to be more heavily Latino, ethnic, a good mix of ethnic minorities, for example. And people who are of middle and lower income tend to go towards the Republican Party, and there's also a gender gap so that the Democratic Party has been attracting more women than men. When it comes to the Central Valley, and actually if you want to even just talk more generally about the political geography of California, you can almost take the state and then draw a line down the middle, and the coast goes blue. The coast goes pretty Democratic most of the time, and the inland counties are where Republicans have gathered and live and have settled, and so the inner part of the state tends to be red. But even in places where you do have Latino / Hispanic majority or coming up on a plurality here, those are places where you either have people like Nunes who do, as you say, are able to appeal to those constituents either because of a kind of name recognition or because they do actually make appeals in the way that they take policy stances. So, for example, you have people like Jeff Denham, who is in a district where he's been able to say, I support dreamers. And if that's the only message that you hear as a voter, you might say, well, that is actually something that I support as well. Now, the entire voting records of the Republicans clearly are not Democratic voters, are not those that appeal to Democratic voters. But they are, in fact, in 30-second campaign ads, pretty well able to sound like moderates and to make appeals to those people who identify across the aisle. So, but just to get back to your main point, these social identity factors, that is how we identify as people, really do help drive our partisanship in some pretty fundamental ways.
You mentioned 30-second campaign ads. That last caller, Gail, was from San Diego, that 50th district race featuring Congressman Duncan Hunter trying to hold on to his seat is in the San Diego area. This is one of the ads being run in that race. This is the group Vote Vets encouraging voters to vote against the congressman, who's also a veteran.
They say you can't pick your family members.
A Republican congressman and his wife are accused of spending $250,000 in campaign funds on themselves.
Whatever she did, that'll be looked at too, I'm sure, but I didn't do it.
Completely throw his wife under the bus. Hunter allegedly stayed the liaison with an individual described as someone who had a, quote, personal relationship with Hunter.
You can't pick your family members, but you can pick your congressman. Vote Hunter out.
That's one ad playing in that 50th district race. Here's another, Congressman Duncan Hunter going after his Democratic opponent.
Amar Kapanajjar is working to infiltrate Congress. He's used 3 different names to hide his family's ties to terrorism. His grandfather masterminded the Munich Olympic massacre. His father said they deserved to die.
A Palestinian-Mexican millennial Democrat named Amar Kapanajjar doesn't get his support from the people of San Diego.
He is being supported by CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a well-orchestrated plan.
Amar Kapanajjar, a risk we can't ignore.
I'm Duncan Hunter, and I approve this message.
Professor Van Vechten, want to get your thoughts on those ads, starting with the second one we showed, USA Today's op-ed pages, their editorial board calling that second ad one of this year's 5 worst political ads.
Right. Well, this is one of those competitive races where there's just a scorched earth policy being executed. You see that Hunter, who had been a shoo-in to this particular seat and has held the seat that was also held by his father, Duncan Hunter Sr., for 28 years. That particular race has become a really great possible seat to flip because Duncan Hunter has been indicted on misusing $250,000 worth of campaign funds. He was caught using some funds to buy personal items, for example, borrowing from his campaign to pay for some personal things, maybe his kids' tuition, that sort of thing. And so these indictments have been levied against him, which of course he has denied. But at the same time, he's facing off Kapanajjar, who has a Mexican mother and a Palestinian father. And so Hunter's been exploiting those facts about him to paint him as somebody who's a threat to the United States. And so you see these campaign ads that just focus on some issues or some items that are going to be very easy for people to remember, but also strike fear in people's hearts. Now, Kapanajjar, for the record, is a Christian. He is not a Muslim, and he didn't know his grandfather. So this is one of those particular ads. One of the reasons why it's actually been called one of the worst ads is because it's clearly guilt by association. So what you see here is Duncan Hunter, who actually has been indicted, and Kapanajjar, who has not been indicted, but it's leading to some very fiery ads on both sides because it looks like Duncan Hunter is quite vulnerable at this point.
taking your calls as we focus on the House races out in California, one of our House battleground states that we're focusing on this week on the Washington Journal. We're joined in this segment by Professor Renee Van Vechten this morning, a political science professor at the University of Redlands, with us until our program ends at 10 o'clock. Jan's waiting in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Go ahead.
Hi. I just want to say I am so sick of the hypocrisy of this Trump people. Now that you better beware, if you're not born in the United States and you declare you're Trump's right, he could throw you out. So, I mean, he was willing to throw his wife out. So, beware of what you want. I'm just so sick of it. Now they want to take the Native Americans and throw them out because they don't have a street address. It's ridiculous. I was born right here. I don't declare. I vote for the person I want. What Trump is doing, saying, if you're not born here, you're out. Well, he can send his wife back home then. What?
That's Jan in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Professor Van Vechten, this issue of birthright citizenship that came up yesterday, I wonder your thoughts of how it might impact races and the political dialogue out in California.
Well, the 14th Amendment does contain the phrase that all persons born here on the United States soil are United States citizens. It's been like that since about 1868 when the 14th Amendment was ratified, and it actually has been vetted by the United States Supreme Court in a couple of different cases, one dating back all the way to 1898 in Wong Kim Ark, where a Chinese person that is an American of Chinese descent was born in San Francisco to parents who were not allowed to be citizens, because at that time we had alien land laws which said you are not allowed to be a citizen if you are of Asian descent. And so in that court case, the United States Supreme Court said, in fact, you are a citizen if you're born here on U.S. soil. There is a phrase that says, or subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and that's where some conservatives have said, well, there's some question over whether if you're an immigrant, whether or not that applies to you, and if you're here as an undocumented immigrant, are you subject to the laws and jurisdiction of the United States? How that is going to play is, I think it can play out in a couple of ways. One of which is that clearly immigration is a very big topic here in California, where 1 out of every 4 persons is born elsewhere. We have a very large Latino population. In fact, out of our 40 million people who live here in California, about 39% are Latino, and about the same number at this point, about maybe 39-40% are white. And we have a very large Asian population as well. And if you actually look at the numbers of immigrants, Asian immigrants are a growing category, or a growing number in the state as well. So this is an issue. Immigration is an issue that strikes the heart of a lot of Californians. And Brown, in his last State of the Union address, has basically said, hey, bring it on. We are ready to defend our immigrants because, as he has said, immigrants make us stronger. And so when Californians who are in that camp, or in that majority really, hear the kinds of comments that Trump is making, and he says we're ready to revisit birthright citizenship, that does mobilize people to vote, and to vote against Trump, really.
Let's head up to Northern California, where Gary's waiting. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call, C-SPAN. I'm from the far north, where we are forgotten up here. And most people consider the Bay Area Northern California. My comment and question is about Senator Dianne Feinstein. She has never been to Northern California, to our districts, for any reason. And I'm wondering why she hasn't got the endorsement of the Democratic Party this year. Can you answer that for me? Thank you.
Well, sure. Well, there are a couple things going on. I think you're right. Northern California really doesn't get a lot of attention from the state senators, in part because they do hail from the middle of the state. They do have to represent everyone in the state, but the most voters tend to be concentrated in big metropolitan areas, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, even San Jose at this point. But what we see from these senators is a kind of they do try to appeal, I think, to everyone. It's not as if they want to forget about those in the North, but it tends to be, I think, more expedient for them to focus on where they're going to get a lot more attention.
Can you focus a little bit on that Senate race in California?
Sure. So at this point, there are 2 Democrats who are vying for this office, Kevin De Leon, and he is from the Los Angeles area, and we have Dianne Feinstein, who's from San Francisco area, of course. And the caller actually did ask about this schism within the Democratic Party, and I think this really does, this race encapsulates that schism pretty well. There's, among Democrats, a kind of more moderate establishment wing of the party. And people like Dianne Feinstein, who've been around Washington for a long time, have learned how to try to get things done as being a member of the minority party in Washington. And they've learned how to compromise and bargain, which is really what you have to do to get anything done generally in politics. But Kevin De Leon is starting to represent a kind of a growing wing of the party. Now, this wing of the Democratic Party is not quite as large as the sort of bigger moderate, more moderate of the liberals. This wing that De Leon is kind of representing at this point is more left-wing than we've seen before. How is that? Well, they want things, these are the Bernie-crats, those who supported Bernie in the last election, Bernie Sanders, that is, and they want universal health care. They want really big ticket items. They're not afraid to tax and spend like most, I would say, liberal Democrats would want to do. That is, they don't mind paying more taxes for more government services. And that is kind of a growing kind of division within the party, although we haven't heard a whole lot about it in this particular election. But Dianne Feinstein is on her way to win one more term. She'll be there for 6 years. And De Leon is possibly the next, he's positioning himself so that maybe in the next go around, as that wing possibly gains more ground, maybe he'll be in a better position to win next time around.
Anderson, California is also in Northern California. Jerome is waiting there. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, John. How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Professor Van Vechten, thank you for taking these calls. Being in the congressional 1st District, we have a race up here that I think is pretty tight because we have Audrey Denny going against the Republican Doug LaMalfa, and she's raised a lot of money. She's getting a lot of support from people, but we hear nothing of it. And again, I'm like Gary. I feel like the middle child of a family where Northern California, the upper regions of California just get passed over by Congress and everybody else because we are such a lowly, sparsely populated area. But that doesn't make it necessary for people not to come here because we are part of California. And there's a big movement now to split California. I'm totally against that because I think California is strong as a state. But I just want to know why we're not focused on as much, especially when this race is so close between Audrey Denny and what's his name. So I'd just like you to comment on that if you could, please. I'll take my answer on the TV.
Jerome, thanks for the call.
Sure. Well, Northern California does have a few issues that are different than some of the rest of the state. I'll bring up the example of opioid addiction. And I clearly don't want to characterize all northern counties as if they have a drug problem. But I would say that opioid abuse, for example, is 3 times higher in some of the Northern California counties than in Southern California counties. That is a problem. But there are other kinds of issues. The environment is clearly environmental climate change is taking a bigger toll on the north as well. When it comes to dead trees, for example, that's a problem wherever you have forests. there are lots of examples where you could say Northern California has some distinctive issues that should be focused on more clearly by some of our representatives. At the same time, you have these congressional districts, people who do represent those areas who are trying to bring them probably to D.C. and also to the state legislature to be dealt with. And so when you have these competitive races, if they're competitive, it's because, in fact, we're in a very special year where, as I mentioned before, this is really kind of a referendum on Trump. And so you will see the enthusiasm factor among Democrats and Republicans both being very, very high. And it's put a lot of different kinds of races in a midterm into play that wouldn't normally be in play, because midterms really don't draw out a lot of voters. This is a kind of different year. Trump has said himself that this is really a vote for your Republican is a vote for me. And so we see that this is really amped up quite a few people and gotten them excited about voting. So as you point out, there are some races that have become competitive where, maybe a few months ago or a year ago, we would not have dreamed that they would actually be competitive. So I think to the extent that Democrats will be showing up at the polls, I mean, that's more or less a reflection of the fact that, again, Californians are not really enamored of Trump overall. Now, if you're a Republican, you have probably not changed your mind. But if you're a Democrat, it's more likely that you're more incensed with every passing day that the Trump administration policies are harmful.
Before we leave that first district race in California, I should note for viewers, the Cook Political Report has that race as currently likely Republican, that race between the incumbent Doug LaMalfa, the Democrat Audrey Denny. But you were just talking about the role that President Trump is playing in these races in California. We can see it in some of the advertisements, especially in some of the most highly contested districts, including the open 39th district. This is the House Majority PAC, a PAC that aligns with Democratic candidates and their ad in that district.
He's the celebrity TV president. She is his apprentice. Young Kim's audition went great. She supported Trump's tax cuts that gave nearly all the benefits to the richest 1%, even though it raises taxes on 60% of Californians. And how will Kim prove her loyalty in Washington? By helping slash Social Security and Medicare to pay for their tax cuts. Young Kim, Trump's apprentice. End of story. House Majority PAC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Professor Van Vechten, do you want to talk a little bit about the 39th district?
Sure. The 39th district features Young Kim, as you just saw in that ad, who is the first Korean American to be in this seat. And she's being challenged by Gil Cisneros. Gil comes from a family that actually won the lottery. And so he spent about $5 million of his own money trying to get into this seat. But Young Kim is a person, I should say, this is actually quite a strongly Republican district, but it is, like most of the other congressional districts, being targeted by Democrats, and money is pouring into these races. And one of the things that I want to point out is that even while the candidates themselves have raised very high sums to win these offices, in the neighborhood of $10 million between the two of them, you've got anywhere from $10 to almost $20 million coming in from elsewhere. And in these particular races, you have people like Michael Bloomberg coming in from out of state, dumping $10 million, $9.5 million into one race just to try to get the Democrat elected. And there's a lot of money pouring in right here, right now, the week before the election. In fact, there was an article that was just came out, an analysis that just came out showing that in this last week alone, for the top 6 congressional district races, $16.5 million has been spent by outside groups alone. So these are very highly contested races. And in the Young Kim case, there's a question, can she duke it out? This is an open seat race. Can she win? It would be likely for her to win because it's a heavily Republican district. So again, can it be flipped? Well, the Democrats are hoping that it will, and that's why they're outspending Republicans in most of these races by large factors.
Just a few minutes left in our program. We'll try to get in one or two more calls. Ian, here in Washington, D.C., go ahead.
Yeah, I live in Washington, D.C. I'm actually originally from East Tennessee, and I can relate and understand people who, feel that their areas might not be being considered by the people running for office. But here in D.C., we just don't have a voice at all. I just left my early voting station, and I don't think I've ever felt so disenfranchised ever. I've lived abroad. I've absentee voted while I was a Tennessee state resident, and I would just say that D.C. residents need a voting voice in the House and in the Senate, and I question the patriotism of anybody who would oppose that.
That's Ian here in Washington, D.C. Professor Van Vechten, did want to ask you, we've been showing stats about each of the states that we've been focusing on in this House Battleground series, among it the population and the governor of the state. Also, the current House delegation in California, it's 39 Democrats, it's 14 Republicans. I wonder if you care to offer any predictions at this point of what that delegation might look like come the beginning of the new year.
Well, if I could do it, you would be paying me a lot more money, $5 million a year. I'll be a consultant. I wish I could make a solid prediction, but I will say maybe a couple of those seats will flip if money really is persuasive as we think it is, and if that money is being put to use in persuasive TV ads, it might swing some of the nonpartisan or those no party preference voters to the Democratic column, and it might draw more people to the polls if the issues themselves provoke enough people to want to cast their votes. But I wish I could make a prediction, but often predictions are wrong. So I'm gonna be a little careful about making any predictions. Maybe we'll see a couple of them flipping. But I will say overall, in an election like this, in a midterm, especially when a president's approval ratings are under 50%, you do tend to have over 30 seats flipping to the other party. In California, the issue is not one of gerrymandering. The issue is I should say we don't have gerrymandered districts because we have Citizen Redistricting Commission that actually wrote the book on these districts. But across the country, you do. So there are tight races everywhere. And it's a question whether or not the Democrats will flip the House, but chances are they will.
Professor Renee Van Vechten is a political science professor at the University of Redlands. It's redlands.edu. You can follow her online on Twitter at ProfRVV. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you so much.
And that's going to do it for our program today. But of course, we'll be back here tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern, 4 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, have a great Wednesday.